Hi, my name is Phil. I'd like to talk about politics. In this video, I'd like to discuss another right that Boris Johnson is preparing to remove under cover of COVID. In this case, your right to be tried by a jury of your peers. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So this week, the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, announced that some trials would scrap juries in order to clear the backlog of new cases, or at least this is what they intend to do. Now, it is being billed as dealing with a backlog caused by the coronavirus measures. And if you didn't follow commentators who work in the justice system in the UK, that might make some sense. After all, COVID measures, especially social distancing, will have made trials very difficult to conduct in court. Makes sense that this would create a backlog. It also makes sense that you'd want to expedite the clearing of that backlog as quickly as possible in order to serve justice. We don't want victims suffering the agony of having trials put back again and again while their perpetrator is unconvicted. And we also don't want innocent people having a trial hanging over their heads for longer than necessary who are being prosecuted. But this backlog is not caused by the pandemic. It has existed for a long time as a direct result of cuts to the justice system. Before this pandemic came along, I was aware that courts were standing empty because the government couldn't be asked paying for them to be run. Cases had to be delayed because computer systems would keep failing. You'd be there in court, the judge would be there, unable to access what they needed, because it's gonna get the new IT system that the government installed years ago still doesn't work. The backlog is down to a combination of a lack of funding and a lack of competence. Much of it, remember, the result of a certain Chris Grayling, and for those who don't know him, he's often called Chris Failing, from his time in the Justice Department, not the present incumbent, who is nowhere near as bad. Even the Telegraph reports on this, which tries to get you to look the other way when the Tories are fouling something up, noted that the backlog increased from 37,500 to over 40,000 during the pandemic, as if, it went up massively over the pandemic. But actually, no, the pandemic did not create a shitstorm for our courts. In reality, if you look at the figures, what they're saying is it was 37,500 before this pandemic ever took hold. Proportionally, it's only actually increased by about the rate it was increasing anyway during the pandemic. It's barely gone up by the average at all. Legal commentators were trying constantly to raise the concept of so-called Nightingale courts along the lines of the Nightingale hospitals that the government set up. Well, they were supposed to set up to treat more people. In the event, it was just a publicity stunt. They didn't actually use them to treat many people. But, you know, the idea was to have extra capacity by, for example, using council buildings, which couldn't be used for their normal purposes during the lockdown. But, like I said, the big reason for the huge backlog in the first place is the government didn't want to pay for having all the available courts running at once before the pandemic. So were they really going to add extra capacity during it? The secret barrister, who some may know, was asking yesterday on Twitter why this announcement from the government wasn't front page news on all papers. In fact, it wasn't front page news on any paper as far as I could see. And it is a fair question. You know, they are going to have a constitutional right removed. Wouldn't you at least expect the media to bring the discussion firmly into the public spotlight, regardless of your views on it? But on the other hand, should we also be surprised? The issues that have been blighting the justice system for years, which I only know about because of first-hand reports from senior representatives who work in the system, judges and barristers, they've never made headline news. There's been reports, sometimes you'll see reports, it's never really splashed across the headlines. Most people will never have anything to do with the justice system in their entire lives. If you don't work in the justice system, you don't fall foul of the law, why would you? And so we can't possibly know what's going on unless it's reported to us. But just because the government want to scrap juries doesn't mean they will get away with this. Now, there is significant opposition even amongst Conservative MPs. As David Davis said, if it's okay to go to a bar, it's okay to go to a courtroom. Of course, it's not okay to go to a bar in the UK right now. It's simply going to be legal to do so next month. But the point is that the government are saying it's okay. But there are ways to organise juries if capacity were increased. I mean, not all players in a trial need to be in the same room, but this would require proper funding. And if the government didn't want to pay for medical equipment during the biggest healthcare crisis of most of our lives, I really don't think they fancy paying to deal with the justice system, which, if truth be told, is a system that, were it to be run properly, would be pretty bad news for most senior Conservatives. But if the opposition were obvious and overwhelming, then the government would not have reiterated their tentative support for the plan yesterday. So the way I read it is this: they're not pushing it really hard at the moment. They're not saying this is definitely going to happen. Obviously, they've had to carry out a number of U-turns recently by pursuing unpopular policies. They don't really fancy another one before summer, I wouldn't have thought. So, yeah, maybe the fact that they're not really pushing it as if it's definitely going to happen is because they're worried about another defeat. But they are still pursuing it, which might suggest that they think they can get enough of their own MPs to support it, to get it through. Doubtless the government will seek to, first of all, assure those MPs that it's a short-term measure. But any Tory MP who isn't a complete imbecile knows that the backlog has a long-term underfunding cause. It's not down to the pandemic, and therefore there will never come a time when the measures, if adopted, will ever be dropped under Conservative rule, because they will never actually get on top of the backlog. Then there come the arguments about the worth of jury trials. Now, this is something you can have a debate about. I have to say, when I was younger, I remember actually debating this at university, and I wasn't sure. In fact, I remember saying, do you know what? If I were to be prosecuted, and I was innocent specifically, I said, if I was innocent, I think I'd prefer a panel of judges to a jury of my peers. And I thought, but if I was guilty, I'd absolutely want a jury of my peers. And this is because I thought that having learned judges decide was better than ordinary citizens who could be swayed by a convincing prosecutor. Much like those same members of the public are fooled by politicians into voting against their own interests. And I was having this debate 20 years before Brexit. But perhaps I'd watched too many court dramas. I am no longer of that view. The reality is that ordinary members of the public are more likely to be fair-minded. Not because judges are inherently unfair-minded, far from it, but there's a small number of them with a very limited experience of life. It's not a slight at judges, but they represent a position in society that doesn't really understand the lives of most people. They don't experience it. And so much of whether a crime is committed or not can often depend on what a reasonable person would do in a particular set of circumstances. How the defendant reacted compared to that, how a reasonable person would react. Now, people who have always occupied an elite position in society may not appreciate some of the factors, not their fault, and certainly not a sign of stupidity. It's an obvious ignorance that cannot be helped. It's caused by a complete lack of experience. We only have our own experiences of life, and often it will be very difficult to understand that of another person's. Juries exist to prevent a judge who lives a privileged lifestyle from unwittingly, wrongly convicting someone as a result of their inherent prejudice, which we all have. A jury of people from different walks of life is much less likely to do this. So what to do? It may be that you are not convinced of the absolute need for the right to trial by jury, as indeed myself of 20 odd years ago was not, in which case you need do nothing potentially. But if you are, as I am now, fully seized of the need to maintain the right to choose trial by jury of your peers, then we have here another classic case of writing to your MP. The government seem to be weighing up support. So particularly if you have a Conservative MP, but it makes no difference. But particularly if you have a Conservative MP, let your MP know where you stand on the issue. Remember, the purpose of writing to MPs isn't always to get them to do something. It's to present your point of view so that they have that to take into account. Let them know where you stand on the issue in order to give them some ammunition in opposing it, if indeed a number of their constituents write in to say, I'm not in favour of this. You may also want to encourage others to write into their MP as well. So there it is. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.